Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be reviewing Pragmatic Naturalism, an Introduction by S. Morris Eames. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Eames. Anyhow, this book was written in 1977, and it talks about philosophical pragmatism, but it calls it pragmatic naturalism rather than just pragmatism. But at any rate, I think it's important to jump into this topic. I've been talking about Greek philosophy, Greek religion for the past few episodes, and there's certainly more to be said on that topic, and I will return to it. But I felt like I had arrived at a fairly natural stopping point, and so I'm jumping into another topic. I'm going to talk about pragmatism in this episode as well as in a number of upcoming episodes. A lot of the books that I read and review, I'm coming at it from a sort of pragmatic perspective, and so pragmatism is actually pretty important to my own personal philosophy and some of the themes that I explore in these various books. I have talked about pragmatism a little bit. I reviewed William James's book called Pragmatism fairly early on in the podcast, and a lot of the themes in that book have come up again and again in other books. But I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper, just because I think this is so important. I think that critical theory is a really dangerous philosophy that is, in a lot of our educational systems, and it really has taken over a lot of the thoughts of the thought processes of our elites. Our educational institutions and many other institutions are embedded with critical theory of one form or another. Critical race theory. I think there's a lot of focus on critical race theory. I think we should be focused more on critical theory itself, and that would encompass critical race theory, because then the conversation becomes about, well, you don't want to teach about history and blah, blah, blah. And the real point is that critical theory is a means of examining things and topics that is inherently, by definition, corrosive. It's designed not just to provide an honest critical critique, but to dismantle by methods of critique. And it's damaging. And I think that we need a good response to it. And if you're a Christian, you may say, well, Christian doctrine is the antithesis of critical theory. And if that's your belief, more power to you. But to a non-Christian, any argument derived from biblical revelation is going to fall on deaf ears. It's not valuable in the realm of philosophical debate. And we need a strong counter-philosophy, if you will. And I am of the opinion that the real counter-philosophy to critical theory is essentially what I would call pragmatic structuralism. It's going to take a good portion of pragmatism and a good portion of structuralism and use those to argue, because a lot of critical theory is rooted in postmodernism, which is rooted in post-structuralism. And so it's, in many ways, critical theory is a response to structuralism. But I think it's a distortion of structuralism, and getting the conversation back to structuralism, and more specifically pragmatic structuralism, is important. So I'm talking about pragmatism for a few books, and then I'll be talking about structuralism for a few books, and we could see if we could put together a sort of philosophy that can be used to counter the arguments of critical theory in the philosophical realm. So that's my objective here with the next few books. And I'm going to start right here with this one because, well, it's billed as an introduction. This book is not really breaking new ground. It's not a treatise in and of itself. It's describing the early pragmatists. It selects 4 early pragmatists. Those would be William James, Charles Peirce, John Dewey, and George Herbert Mead. Mead is not always associated as one of the important early pragmatists. He doesn't have a lot of writings. I would say that Dewey and James are the real big two. Peirce doesn't have a tremendous amount of writings either, and he kind of his heyday was before James really introduced pragmatism to the world. James got some of his ideas from his friend Peirce, but if you really want to get the nuts and bolts of it and you want to get it in a manner that is digestible to a layperson, you've got to go to William James and John Dewey. Those are like the big names, and we'll be exploring them both. Dewey is often associated with the political left. I think he's a man of the left, but he has a number of good ideas, and I think it's important that we understand that all of history, all of the history of philosophy, is ours for the taking. This is a dead white male, and so there's going to be a certain reticence, even though many of his ideas constitute much of the left. I think that the left is kind of purging itself of dead white males, and maybe we should be there to pick up the pieces and see what we can find from the discarded remnants of philosophy that have been cast off by progressives. So we should look to John Dewey and also William James and see what we can find of their writings and teachings that we can apply to our modern era. And so, as in all of my reviews, I'm going to read a number of portions of this book aloud and comment on them. I think I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess 7 parts of the book that I want to read, and these are not chronological at all. I'm kind of jumping around the book to hit on the points that I think are the most important. And so let me jump right in here and start looking at this section. This is from a section called A Pluralistic Universe. In this section, the author says, quote, "During the latter half of the 19th century, one of the most prevailing philosophies on the continent of Europe and in Great Britain was known as the philosophy of the absolute. There are various versions of this way of looking at nature and life, and William James appears to have taken a critical view of all of them. One version of the philosophic issue was taken to be the conflict between monism and pluralism, or what philosophers have often posed as the problem of the one and the many. In James's simple and direct way of putting the matter, it is the problem of the all form and the each form. By this he means that monism holds that there is one form which envelops all others, that the world is already organized into a unified whole. James claimed that it is impossible to find one form which can be related empirically to all other forms in nature and life. In some philosophers' abstract vision of things, and in their attempt to view the parts from the standpoint of the whole, they might dream of this monistic kind of unity, but it is only a dream. The world is pregnant with discontinuities, and the continuities we do encounter in experience and nature are so diverse that no certain and absolute unity can contain them. Not able to find an empirically verifiable interrelatedness of all things, a universe in which every part is internally related to every other part, James affirmed his belief in a pluralistic universe. The disjunctions found in experience and nature are too insistent and too real to be explained away by some kind of abstract manipulation. Thus they belong to a kind of extra-empirical or speculative metaphysics. That there are specific and particular causal processes running through nature, there is no doubt. For instance, under certain conditions, typhoid germs cause typhoid fever. In another instance, when water is heated to 212 degrees Fahrenheit under certain conditions, it boils. The typhoid fever and the boiling water are two different causal processes. What is the observable evidence which supports the claim that these two causal processes, different as they are, in so many respects, are really the result of one single causal process, which brings both of them about? To claim that they are united by some means, but one does not know how, is to make a leap of faith, or at least a leap into speculation. As pragmatic naturalists see the world existing in its present state, it is a world in which there is both continuity and discontinuity, and both of these processes are real. This view gives us a world that is loosely hanging together. In fact, some parts of the world do not fit in with other parts at all. In this respect, it is not a perfectly ordered universe, nor is it the best of all possible worlds as pictured by Leibniz. End quote. Okay, so this kind of comes back to some of the stuff that I have been talking about previously with monism and pluralism. And, he's basically saying that the idea that everything is connected in some way is really just speculative. We can't say that empirically. And so we look to the world and it's really more loosely hanging together. There are things that work together and there are things that don't work together. I'm of the opinion that this is a tricky question and needs to be answered with sort of caveats. I do think that there's a sort of a structure to the universe. There are laws that are applicable everywhere, and the fundamental laws of reality unfold in order to create a multiplicity. But it's kind of like a question of how that's possible, because you can't get many out of one, really. Even like from the Big Bang to, if you were to say that the Big Bang occurs and then all of the various components of the universe, spill out from this singular point, and then, through natural processes, they unfold and act out according to their structural demands, the demands of the structures of the atoms, so that, like we looked at in No Choice Theory, that everything has a structure. Every atom and molecule has a shape and a structure to it that dictates how it behaves, and everything in the world is comprised of these molecular structures. And so you might say that there's a system by which everything is unfolding, and this is the hard determinism. And I tend to be a believer in hard determinism. So in that sense, you might say that there's a sort of oneness to the world, but that's on a very abstract plane. You can't necessarily just extrapolate that to all sorts of other areas. Like when I looked at Encountering Naturalism way back in I think that was like episode 3. People will take this quote-unquote unity of all things, the oneness of all things, and think that means that, like, we're all one big family, and so on and so forth, and just dismiss all of the various disparate parts and competing parts that constitute reality. You can't boil it down to just one thing and dismiss all of the many different things in the world which are acting in a sort of competition with one another. And there's kind of a process of creative destruction. There's not a unity and cooperation as like this dominant force in the world. There's competition, destruction, birth, death, things being created and things being destroyed perpetually. It'll never boil down to just one thing. There's always many things. Even within the contents of the Big Bang, you might say that all of the matter in the universe was jammed into this tiny little speck, but it was still all of the stuff. It wasn't one thing. Even, it must have, like, even if it was one thing and it split into many things, something must have acted upon it to cause the one thing to split. And so there must be more than just one thing. It's always, I look at it like a car. A car is comprised of wheels and engine and windshield wipers. And you could say it's a car. Therefore, the car is one thing. It's one car. But that doesn't ever make the case that, the door and the antenna are illusions. None of the components of the car are like illusions. They're all very real, and the car can't be just boiled down to a singular thing. It's only a thing insofar as it is a collection of parts. And just like the universe is a collection of parts that follow certain laws, it's not ever just one thing, despite the fact that it can be seen as a machine operating according to certain laws. Like a car is a machine that operates according to certain laws the universe is a machine operating according to certain laws, that doesn't ever eliminate the separateness of the various components. So in that regard, you can kind of look at it as both one and many, and trying too hard to isolate it as just one thing or just many things is sort of an exercise in futile conceptualization and maybe like reductionism, trying to turn the universe into some simple this or that. That's just too simple. So I think it's a little bit of both. But the pluralism, the fact that pragmatism acknowledges and promotes the pluralism of the world is important, because there are so many philosophies and so many religions and so many ideas that are constantly harping on about the unity of the universe and the oneness of all things and so on and so forth, like we saw in the book on the elements of pantheism. It's constantly pushing unity and oneness, and that's only part of the equation. And not only is it only part of the equation, but it's a sort of thing that you can only infer through examination and study, and you can only ever really postulate, but you can never truly grasp the oneness of all things. It's something that you have to propose. But when you look around, like the manyness of the universe is right in front of you and readily apparent. So the pluralism, the separation of things, this is like obvious. You don't have to dig around. You don't have to conceptualize it. Just open your eyes. You can see that the universe is comprised of many things. And the oneness of all things is only ever going to be like a theory. So I think that's important, that we maybe prioritize the plurality of the world over the unity of the world, because the plurality of the world is what we're contending with on a day-to-day basis. So there's that section there, and then let me jump to the next section when the author talks about experience and the pragmatic naturalist conception of what experience is. So in this section, he says, quote, "Pragmatic naturalists use the term experience in the fullest and most comprehensive sense. The word denotes feelings, transactions, and continuities. It refers to physical bodies and ideas and relations. It refers to sensations, concepts, desires, and emotions. It refers to actualities and ideals. Other philosophers confronting such an array of items have usually selected some one aspect of experience as primary and ultimate. This procedure allows them to use a simple criterion against which all the rest of experience is judged. The traditional empiricists, for instance, bring all other parts of experience to the court of sensations for the ultimate test of certainty and reliability. The traditional rationalists select pure, abstract concepts for a measuring rod to be applied to the rest of experience. Materialists, who emphasize the physical, and idealists, who select some notion of the mental, have elevated their particular selections into what is ultimate and real. Thus, each of the philosophical critics can say that the pragmatic naturalist makes experience to mean everything and anything, that this view of experience is so inclusive and comprehensive that there is nothing by which one part of experience can be measured, tested, and certified by any other. These are significant criticisms, and they must be met if the pragmatic naturalist is to defend the fullness of experience as his starting place. The answer to these criticisms of competing philosophies is found in the nature of experience itself. Primary experience possesses some generic traits, and one of these is the occurrence of discontinuities. In the movement of the organism through space-time, it encounters difficulties and perplexities. Questions are asked and problems posed. How shall these irritations be removed? How shall the discontinuities be bridged and overcome so that life can proceed? In the course of the organism's impulsion through time, its forward thrust, its responses at first are of the trial and error sort. The organism explores its environment. It searches and finds some way out of the perplexity it faces. If it does not find a way out, it dies. In trying to overcome its organic irritation and uneasiness, the organism finds that certain means, which are accidentally discovered, lead to certain ends. These relationships of means to ends are so integral to each other that they cannot be separated. On the lower levels of stimulus-response sequences, where they have become automatic over the long years of evolutionary development, these sequences result in efficiencies which are difficult to match on the more complex levels of deliberate control. When symbolic behavior emerges from these organic foreshadowings, then humans can transcend certain parts of their experience and can reflect upon what happens to themselves in the course of living. They become aware of the relationships which sustain them on the non-reflective level. They note that these relationships involve various parts of experience which have become differentiated into physical objects, sensations, concepts, and intellectual operations. The philosophers who single out one aspect of these interacting processes put forth a partial truth about experience, but they give biased accounts because they put the selected parts of experience in the wrong context. The occurrence of discontinuities, the appearance of the perplexing and the problematic, and the emerging awareness of how these can be overcome by the use of relations of means and ends, which have actually been successful, allow human beings to assimilate all relevant objects, sensations, concepts, and ideas to the process of problem solving. This approach provides for an unbiased treatment of the various elements of experience which other philosophers have selected as ultimate and more real than any of the rest. In overcoming some discontinuities of experience, human beings find that certain methods are more successful than others. They study these means-ends continuities, symbolize them, and recognizing their great usefulness in the solutions of problems, evolve a method from experience which is the greatest single means of controlling other parts of experience. This method is the method of intelligence. Intelligence is a method of solving problems, of establishing continuities in experience and nature where disjunctions have occurred. When intelligence is defined functionally, the problem-solving behavior of other animals may be termed intelligent. This meaning of intelligence is consistent with the idea of the continuity of other forms of animal life with the forms of higher and more complex organisms, such as humans. The method of intelligence in human life becomes more sophisticated, however, because they are able to construct and to use a language. This makes the use of intelligence subject to deliberate choice and deliberate correction in case of errors detected in its use. Mention has been made of the generic traits of existence, some of which are the disjunctions, which occur in the perceptual flow of experience. Disjunctions are not limited to those found in human experience. Disjunctions occur in other parts of nature. This generic trait is not manufactured and imposed upon nature. Disjunctions, disruptions actually occur. Disjunctions exist. They are there in nature and in experience. They must be dealt with realistically to reestablish the equilibrium, or there is disintegration. These disjunctions are situational in character. They involve such disruptions as an exploding volcano, a receding ice age, explosions on the sun, imbalances in animal life, in which some have become extinct. Examples of problematic situations need not be as dramatic as those just cited. They occur all through nature in less spectacular ways, applying to such events as the decline of whooping cranes and the increase of buffalo herds. End quote. All right, so what he's talking about here is the concept of experience as being all-inclusive, and so taking other philosophies which take this or that part of experience and kind of set them up on a pedestal as the true measure of experience, the real thing that by which we need to judge everything else. This particularly applies, I think, to rationalists who would say that, the human is a rational animal and therefore our purpose is to be rational, and all activity, therefore, is judged by its rationality. All experience is judged by whether it's rational or irrational, and just sort of taking a bit of life and setting it up as the real important aspect of life. And I think the other part that he's talking about is that of the disjunctions, which I had just mentioned previously, in that in your day-to-day experience, there's always challenges where your objectives and reality are in conflict. Your objectives and the objectives of another person, or your objectives and the objectives of the animals on which you feed, are not the same. And so there's conflict between entities, and there are different, goals. Like, we have the goal of surviving, and nature doesn't have the goal. Nature as such doesn't necessarily have the goal of helping us to survive. So this conflict exists in the world, and that needs to be recognized as, he calls it, a disjunction, where things aren't just everything flowing together and everything pleased with the mechanism by which it's connected. Like I mentioned in a previous episode, a lion hunting a gazelle, they're both part of a unified system of, life on Earth, the circle of life, and so forth. But neither of them are cooperating with one another. That sort of disjunction is what he's talking about. And so the method that we use to maneuver our way through these disjunctions is experience, is intelligence. And so intelligence is what we use to evaluate all of the various experiences that we have. But even here, I think he sort of sets intelligence up as like this most important of mechanisms. But the truth is that instinct is also incredibly important in humans and animals in maneuvering their way through a potentially hostile world. But the philosopher often elevates philosophy. We've seen this from Plato onward. The thinker elevates thinking as the most important task. This is sort of human nature. Whatever it is that we do and we specialize in, we say, well, that's clearly the most important aspect of human existence, is this particular thing that I'm engaged in. And so the professor, the thinker, the teacher, is always going, not always, but is often going to elevate thinking and teaching as these primary components of the human experience. Intelligence is certainly an important part of how we interact with the world, but if you're looking at intelligence as conscious, deliberate thought and problem solving, that's really only a fraction of how it is that we contend with disjunctions and discontinuities and problems when things don't go our way. There's a portion of it that is instinctual. There's a portion of it that is simply biological. We contend with germs biologically, not through our intelligence. And so all of human activity, including intelligence, needs to be understood as part of our capacity and our response to problems and our response to the so-called disjunctions of reality. Let me just jump around to my next section that I want to read. Give me a moment. Okay, for this section, I'm going right back to pretty early on in the book when he's talking about evolution. This is from Part 1, Chapter 1, The Influence of Darwin. And let me just say before I read this, Part 1, Chapter 1, The Influence of Darwin, I think that the placement of this chapter at the very beginning of the book emphasizes something that's important here. And that is that the pragmatists were very much influenced by Darwin and by evolutionary theory. And that's important because so many philosophies that had come about prior to this had maybe in some areas sort of hinted at the possibility of an evolutionary understanding, but hadn't been really codified. It hadn't been stated clearly by Darwin. And I think that pragmatism is really the first philosophy that explicitly takes stock of what evolutionary theory implies for philosophy, the ways that philosophy must adapt to evolutionary theory. And so pragmatism is a sort of evolutionary philosophy, because evolution is kind of consequentialist, and pragmatism is kind of consequentialist. That which works and is effective practically, that which yields results, is what lasts, is what succeeds and propagates. And that which does not work, does not advance, the philosophy that doesn't advance its holder, or the biological adaptation that doesn't promote the survival of its bearer, will not last. So there's a sort of survival of the fittest in philosophical ideas, in biological ideas, and pragmatism, in its consequentialist nature, says concepts of truth and explanations of what truth is are dependent on what works. If it works, then it's true. If it doesn't work, then it's not true. And that's the extent that we can know what the truth is simply by examining what works and doesn't work. And that's a lot of the core of pragmatism. And you can kind of see the evolutionary underlying strands in that. So anyway, let me jump in here and read the section where he talks about evolution. So in this section, he says, quote, "The problem of what is permanent and what is changing in nature has been perplexing from the early inception of the critical method of philosophical and scientific inquiry. Ancient and medieval thinkers observed that change takes place in the individual during its lifetime. For instance, a specific individual living in space and time grows to a mature form and gradually loses this form in death. The growth toward maturity of an individual within a species was often called generation. The disintegration of the form of the individual was called decay. For example, particular horses are born, grow to maturity, and begin gradually to decay until death destroys the particularized form they embody. Thus it was held that particular individuals within natural species are changing. The important point, however, for the ancient and medieval thinkers was that the form or species does not change. Each species is fixed, unchanging, and permanent. While others entertained the ideas of evolution before Darwin, it is his place in the history of science to bring previous hypotheses together and to present them in a generalized theory of nature. There are parts of the Darwinian theory which the pragmatic naturalists do not accept without qualification, and they think that intelligence plays a far greater role in human survival in an evolutionary world than Darwin allows. Two central parts of Darwin's theory, however, have had significant impact upon the pragmatic naturalists' conception of nature and of human life. The first of these conceptions is that the forms or species of nature are changing. This is a denial that there are absolutely unchanging forms in nature. Some species may become extinct, as have the dinosaurs. Others, as those now living in our present world, may survive. The second idea of Darwin's, of importance for a conception of nature, concerns the survival of the various species. Survival of some species takes place by production of millions of progeny, and not all of these reproductions survive. One species survives by consuming other species. Mutations occur, environmental conditions change, and some species become extinct. These facts throw doubt upon the view that nature does nothing in vain, and upon those views of nature which are called teleological, that is, which state that each natural species has a purpose, or that nature as a whole has a purpose. Darwin's conception of nature points up the precarious existence of all natural forms, including human life. The belief in a changeless nature, in fixed and permanent forms, was shattered by this new conception of nature. Intellectual responses to Darwin's view of nature have varied. Some try to harmonize the view of changing forms and species with a belief in the general direction or purpose of all evolutionary change. Others deny that there is any purpose or goal involved in the changing species of nature." End quote. Okay, so we see here this concept of unchanging nature. It's sort of people are born, people die, but the race continues, the human race continues, nature continues, and so there's something particularly sacred or special about the forms that exist, the species that exist, and evolution kind of throws that totally aside. And evolutionary theory, it does sort of propose that, if things were to go askew, it's entirely possible that the human species could become extinct. And, what would be the end result but a bunch of concrete monuments? And so there's nothing permanent about us. And moreover, the premise here is that not only can we change, but we probably will change. We have changed. We didn't used to be humans. We used to be something other than human ages ago. We were different, and we will be different at some point in the future. And so this really throws the whole concept of these ideal forms out the window. There is no like singular thing of what we are, what humans are. But then this can be taken too far. And the fact is that I can fully expect that the vast majority of children being born right now are born with 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and standing upright, capable of language. Right? There's certain things that, while not necessarily permanent, they're at least long-lasting enough that for our purposes, they are functionally permanent. You don't want to go so far as to say, everything is in flux, everything is changing, everything is a spectrum, there's nothing pinned down, there's nothing real or true because everything is this crazy flux of change. And we can be whatever we want to be. Human beings can be anything we want. We have no, this ties into the whole concept that we're like blank slates. Our psychologies are blank slates. We have nothing about us that's inherent. That's the opposite extreme, of course. And the truth is that there is such a thing as human nature. There is such a thing as ways of being human. And moreover, there's cultural qualities and cultural natures. A culture is like this. A culture is like that. If you're born within a certain culture, you behave a certain way. You believe certain things that you inherit from your parents. There's a continuity in life, but there's also a sort of flux as well. Acknowledging that flux and change doesn't necessarily turn us into Plato, and that's not the philosopher Plato, it's the, silly putty type of Plato is what I mean. We're not just completely moldable. We have something about us that is, for all intents and purposes, permanent. But at the same time, we must acknowledge the evolutionary qualities of our permanent natures. So if there are things about us that are functionally permanent, they're not over the long term permanent, which means that they came about at some point. All of the things about us came about at some point because we weren't always like this. We can trace ourselves all the way back to single-celled organisms, and everything about who we are now came about at some point during that process. And if it came about at some point during that process, then you can assume, absent any other competing evidence, that it's generally probably an adaptive trait. It's a quality that we acquired in order to help us survive. So those things about us are more or less beneficial. All of those qualities that we have are more or less beneficial. If there's some part of us that we're prone to genetic deformities or something, you'd say, oh well, that's a bad thing that we're prone to these genetic deformities, but it's not, because the genetic mutation is the mechanism by which we got here. Everything has some adaptive quality, or else we wouldn't have it. It wouldn't have developed within us. So I guess I think that it's important that the premises of evolution, fill up our philosophical conversation. It must be accounted for. The evolutionary process must be accounted for, and we must have a philosophy that conforms with evolutionary theory. And I think that's one of the things that makes pragmatism, or pragmatic naturalism, as this author calls it, so important for us, because it really is the first and I think most accurate philosophy to adopt that. So let's move on to the next section. In this section, he's talking about values. This is the chapter 13, General Theory of Value. And what he says here is that, according to John Dewey, belief in, quote, belief in some kind of absolute or transcendental value stems from the quest for certainty. The natural world in which we live undergoes constant change. Some things are relatively stable, while others are relatively unstable. The longing for something to believe in, for something secure, for something to hold on to in a precarious world, has had a tremendous hold upon the psychological and emotional in human beings. Where securities cannot be elicited from the relatively stable parts of nature, they have been invented. Humans have selected those parts of nature which are valued in ordinary experience, have abstracted from these, and have constructed a realm where they are held to be unchanging and absolute. Ideals and goals, regarded as unchanging, give a feeling of absoluteness and certainty about values. When the tentative nature of scientific beliefs invaded the picture of nature and of human life, then the feeling of absoluteness was destroyed, and modern life appears to swim in a sea of uncertainty. Human responses to the emerging scientific picture of the universe have been varied. Some people still cling tenaciously to their claims that values are absolute and unchanging in spite of the tentative nature of scientific beliefs about the world. A sharp distinction is sometimes made between science and value. Value is then elevated into a realm which goes beyond science. It is claimed that the subject matters and methods of value, usually the methods of intuition and abstract reason, are distinctively different from science, and that some of the methods of science, experimentation for instance, cannot apply. Others have responded by claiming that, after all, values are what each individual thinks or feels is valuable. Thus, value feelings and thoughts are purely subjective. A theory which has enjoyed wide currency in contemporary times is the emotive theory, which in its most extreme statement appears to hold that value expressions are ejaculatory, that is, they are like interjections in grammar. Words such as good or bad do not state anything or say anything, not even about a person's feelings. Such expressions simply evince or manifest the latter. The pragmatic naturalists reject the foregoing philosophical analyses of the present situation in the confusion in values. The situation, while perplexing, can be arrested by starting on a different line of attack in thinking and studying about values. The proper starting place, they say, is a behavioral one. They hold that we need to observe human behavior in order to see what each individual selects and rejects from the array of objects within the scope of a particular person's environment. It is noted that certain objects are prized and cherished and loved, other objects are rejected. What is prized, what is cared for, what is loved, may be taken as objects of value. Prizing one's home, caring for the health of the body, loving one's family, taking pains about one's work, cherishing some art object, enjoying a piece of music or poetry, working for some social cause, devoting time and effort to international peace, are some instances of a person's observable valuational behavior. The objects loved and cared for are dependent upon particular situations in which these objects function as values. For instance, fire is valued when it functions in situations where warmth is needed for the health and comfort of our bodies, or where it is useful in cooking our meals. When fire destroys our homes or our forests, however, then it is not a valued object in those circumstances. Instances such as this can be multiplied. Critical analysis is needed in each situation in order to determine if some object is or is not of value. Again, some objects are valued at one time of an organism's development and discarded at another. A baby finds its nursing bottle a source of nourishment, therefore of value. Adults, however, find other means and sources of nourishment and put away childish things. Much of the business of life is knowing when to give up an object or value which no longer meets our needs. Because value objects are loved and cherished, because they are accomplished with strong emotional attachments, value adjustments are the hardest to make. Keeping abreast of life's changes and keeping experience integrated and serene at every stage, from childhood through old age, is an ideal by all who take the value problem seriously. Since life does not remain absolutely stable, since it shifts and is constantly on the move, value behavior takes two dominant forms. One, we try to preserve some object of value already in existence, to guard it against the constant threats of extinction. Two, we attempt to bring into existence some object which will meet the demands of the situation, in which case the sought-after object takes on the quality of becoming a value. The objects we prize and care for are under continuous threat of being destroyed. This condition exists for two reasons. One, our biological organisms are changing and developing throughout our lives, thus our responses to a certain value may waver and finally cease. Changes within ourselves may cause a value object held at one time in life to be rejected at another time. These organic changes, such as the one mentioned above in the movement from infancy to adulthood, may affect what we love and care for. Two, the environment which sustains each individual's life may change. Economic depressions may upset our carefully planned economic values, a flood may destroy our homes, a loved one may die. These environmental changes, along with our organic changes, always put some valued object in peril. End quote. So obviously he goes on from there, but that was all I wanted to read from that section. And this is important because just like the human being is not a permanent thing, what we value is also not a permanent thing. And this is an issue that becomes very challenging for people on the right who tend to like to see a sort of objective, permanent sense of right and wrong and of good and evil, and that these things are outside of human control. What is right and wrong are objectively defined for the world. And particularly when you get into religious people who will say that, right and wrong are prescribed by God, and you get the argument that seems pretty popular that, like Dostoevsky says, without God, everything is permissible. This idea that this is usually held by people who, worship God, that if you take God away, then there's no source of objective values, and so what's right and wrong just becomes whatever we want it to be. And I've mentioned this before, but it's really a false dichotomy between these objective values, these permanent, transcendental objective values of right and wrong, and then a wide open blank sheet of paper of what is right and wrong is whatever we decide it is. I want to say this is right, therefore it's right, because there's no other greater force in the world telling me otherwise. And that's the sort of two extremes that we're supposed to have to choose from. But the reality is that, values lie somewhere in the middle. There's a sort of permanence to it. If you understand values from an evolutionary perspective, then you would say that, well, it just so happens that like food that's healthy for you, for instance, tastes good. And on the whole, in a wild environment, in the environment in which we evolved, which would be the wild nature, sugary things are hard to come by. And so when we get them, we like them. We pursue fruits and we pursue sweet things because, we're getting, sucrose, which isn't necessarily in abundance in nature. So in a natural environment, you could say that those things which taste good and which we pursue are those things which are good for us, whereas rotten food or, spoiled things, generally, things which are bad for us, don't taste good, don't smell good. And we evolved that response. And so I know that's just taste, But values are similar in that things which we value tend to be those things which help us and our community or tribe survive and thrive. And those things which we generally consider to be wrong don't help us individually or don't help our communities to be stable and thriving. There's a practical, consequential component to values. And generally speaking, this is not an absolute, but generally speaking, most of the world holds somewhat similar values. Obviously, there's a lot of disparity, but there's not total disparity. There are certain things like murder that tends to be wrong in most societies. But this is one of those weird things where you're mixing in our biological responses with our cultural responses, because every culture has sort of norms that it's imposing that are modifications of your biological values. And we adopt those, and sometimes we think that they are our own, that we created them ourselves, or that they're self-evident, but that's not always the case. So we'll be looking at in some future books, and some of the books we looked at previously, such as The Righteous Mind, and some other stuff coming up, we'll be looking at what values are, how they're created, because cultural evolution happens on such a fast scale compared to biological evolution, it's entirely possible for maladaptive cultural traits to arise and spread. Eventually, they will die off. Just like a maladaptive trait in a biological organism will not persist over the long term because it is counterproductive, and it might persist for a little while because its impact on survivability is, not negligible, but not severe, and so it could propagate for some time, but it won't last over the long term because it's a maladaptive trait. The same thing occurs in cultures and societies. We can have maladaptive traits in our societies, in our value structures, that aren't conducive to survival, and ultimately cultures that embrace maladaptive values will not last. But that's a whole great and interesting area of exploration that we'll be diving into deeper. But I think that part of the point here is that pragmatism is I think deeply tied, as I've said, to evolutionary theory. And that's something that needs to be emphasized. I don't know as though it's really acknowledged as much as it should be, that if you're looking for a philosophy that embraces the evolutionary theory, or the theory of evolution and evolutionary psychology, pragmatism really is that philosophy. All right, so let me move on from there. This section is from the chapter Human Life in Nature. And the author says, quote, "Pragmatic naturalists conceive of humans as a part of nature. Although they share many organic processes with other animals in their life in nature, humans emerge above the animals in certain forms and functions. For instance, humans can construct symbols and languages, they can speak and write, and by these means they can preserve their past experiences, construct new meanings, and entertain goals and ideals. Humans can make plans, and by proper selection of the means to the ends, carry them through. They can write poetry and novels, compose music and painting, and otherwise engage in aesthetic experiences. They can construct explanatory hypotheses about the world and all that is in it, of electrons, protons, and neutrons in solar systems far away. They can dream dreams, concoct fantasies, erect heavens above the earth, which entice their activities to far-off destinies, and they can imagine hells which stimulate fears of everlasting torture. The emergent functions of symbolic behavior make it possible for humans to transcend parts of their immediate undergoing and experiencing, and to know that death and all that entails it is a part of organic life. There is little wonder that, with the tremendous number of functions which humans can perform, many thinkers throughout history have thought of themselves as rather special creations, creatures endowed with powers to function in multitudinous ways and to effect the many transformations in themselves and their environment. It has been thought, could have had their origin only in some source which transcends all nature and human life. Theories abound which hold to some version of this link of humans with a supernatural or transcendental realm, and various metaphysical and speculative constructions have been constructed which set them off as uniquely different from the rest of nature. Human evolutionary ties with other parts of nature, and with other animals in particular, are too obvious to overlook. A naturalistic view brings this kinship of human life and nature to the fore. In organic structures and functions, humans have affinities with other animals. For instance, some animals have lungs and breathing and sexual organs for reproduction. The key to understanding human life in nature is the principle of continuity, in which the lower processes of organic life are tied to the higher processes and functions. In former times, it was popular to say that a human being is a creature who is a little lower than the angels. The naturalistic philosopher holds that a human being, while sharing affinities with other parts of nature, is a little higher than the animals. Pragmatic naturalists inherited a view of human beings which maintains that each possesses a soul, or mind substance, or consciousness. Usually these terms are thought to designate an entity which exists outside the natural processes. The history of pragmatic naturalism could be written as a purging and a withering away of this traditional concept of human beings. James and Dewey started out with an interest in physiology and physiological psychology, and Mead's studies with James and others were always immersed in the organic view of human life. Dewey made an observation about James's classic work on the principles of psychology, an observation which could be applied to himself as well. He claims that James moves more and more within this work toward the view that human beings are organisms. The starting place of the pragmatic naturalists, in their view of human life, is with an organism living by means of an environment. From this organic base emerge the many complex and complicated processes of perceiving, remembering, imagining, symbolizing, thinking, valuing, and judging. The emergence of new organs in the human body, new differentiations in natural forms, makes possible new interactions or transactions in an environment. These new forms and functions make new demands upon the environment, and the development of organism and environment as a balance of energies expands. The relation of organism and environment is a functional affair, and it is only an abstraction that one can talk about environment and organism as things apart. This relation is not one in which a discrete entity called the organism and another discrete entity called the environment are viewed as separate and self-enclosed and then are brought together in some kind of interaction with each other. Interaction never means, for the pragmatic naturalist, the action and reaction between two separate entities, and that is why some would rather use the term transaction to describe the balance of energies which can be separated only in abstraction. End quote. All right, so that's a little bit of a complicated section there, but really more or less he's saying that the pragmatic naturalists have really worked to dissolve this premise that exists that human beings are, fundamentally separate from nature. But instead saying that we're organisms, we're animals, we're more complex than your average animal. We're, leaps and bounds more complex than other creatures. And obviously, just looking around, you could say, well, we do seem to be fundamentally different than cats and dogs. Something about us is just deeply different. But nonetheless, we emerged out of the animal world. We still carry many, many, many qualities of animals, other animals, and we should be understood within the context of being beings that are embedded in nature, and that for the vast majority of our history as humans, not to mention our history as evolving entities, we existed in a really symbiotic state with the rest of the natural world and with other animals. And so to truly understand humans, you must see us in that context as being embedded in nature. And I think that's a great and important view of humans. I'm not going to say much more than that. I think that's self-explanatory. It's just a new, different, more, I would say, more scientifically accurate understanding of what we are. And I also think that if, as I stated, pragmatic naturalism and pragmatic structuralism is going to be kind of set against critical theory, it should be stated that much of critical theory does sort of set us outside of nature in the sense that behaviors and activities and qualities which we have inherited from our past as animals that we carry with us today, and that we inherited from our past as, early humans, our tribal identities. Many of the things that we carry with us from the past are like dragging us down and holding us back from achieving what is possible for humans, which would be a sort of purging of all of the animalistic aspects of our nature and turning us into sort of, I don't want to say robots, but entities that are completely dominated and driven by ideals such as justice and liberty and this and that, or whatever, equality, whatever the ideal may be. Maybe the ideal is equality and justice and freedom, liberty, and whatever it may be, and many, outside critical theory, but many political ideals set up of all stripes, set up these abstract ideals as what we're truly after, what we're truly pursuing. And in order to get to where we're going, we have to shed these relics of the past. Those relics of the past are like fundamental to who we are, what we are, how we got here, how we came to be human beings was through the application and through the unfolding of these natural qualities, these animalistic qualities of us. They're deeply embedded in us. There's a sort of disdain for who and what we are within a lot of modern and postmodern philosophy. So let me jump to the next section. And that would be when he talks about individualism, and I think this kind of ties into what I was just saying. He says, quote, "Some traditional concepts of human life have been put forth by philosophers who view a human being as an atomic discrete unit, a separate soul or self, a mental or spiritual substance completely divorced from a life in nature and the transactions involved. Once this kind of dichotomy is made, then problems arise of how the mind interacts with the body, of how the mind knows objects thought to be cut off from itself, of how the separate, discrete mind can share with another separate, discrete mind. Such problems have plagued philosophers for centuries, primarily because a sharp line was drawn, dividing natural processes into two irreconcilable functions, thus setting up the condition of unsolvable problems. Terms like subject and object come in to confuse the problem. The problem of the meaning of subjectivity is heightened. The function of consciousness as an emergent in human life is transformed into an entity, into a substance, which is thought to be vital to the notion of personal identity and the basis for individuality. According to the pragmatic naturalists, the act of transforming a function into an entity is one of the greatest errors in the history of philosophy." End quote. And that's really important, that last line. I'm going to read it again. According to the pragmatic naturalists, the act of transforming a function into an entity is one of the greatest errors in the history of philosophy. What does that mean, transforming a function into an entity? Well, that's to say that there is a self or a soul or an entity, a thing, which is inside of you, which is separate from your body. You've got a body and you've got a mind. And the mind is really who you are. I am this mind. And I have a body. And but you don't have a mind. You are not a mind. You have a brain, and your brain thinks. Your brain engages in a process of thought, and it's a function of your brain. Just like your heartbeat is a function of your heart. Your heartbeat isn't a thing. It's a process that your heart undergoes. And your mind is a process. It's a function. Your brain is engaging in thinking. And the ongoing thinking process that your brain is engaged in is what we identify as ourselves. And we transform this function of thought into an entity, into a thing, which is separate from the brain, which is separate from the organ, which is engaging in the process. We are processes. Our brains, our thoughts, our minds, our processes, our functions. And not only is your mind a function, a process of your brain, an activity of your brain is thinking, but that thinking function is an adaptive quality that your body has acquired through the evolutionary process. Right? Your body came first before brains. A single-celled organism doesn't think. Right? You could trace your ancestors back to single-celled organisms, which means you could trace your ancestors back to non-thinking entities. And the thinking process was a process that developed through the evolutionary process. Right? It's a function of your body that helps your body to survive, helps your body to replicate itself. Helps your body to be able to engage in the activities that allow it to survive and procreate. It's an adaptive function. And we shouldn't understand it as an entity, an isolated entity that we can't, our philosophers can't even really put their finger on how it is that the mind connects with the outer world, how we can really know anything. So I'll just leave it at that. This is a topic that obviously we've touched on a little bit in the past, and we'll touch on it again in the future. But let me just say also, while I'm on it, is that this concept of the mind as an entity separate from the body is absolutely 100% responsible for the entire transgender notion, right? That your mind is at war with your body. You're born in the wrong body. That you need to do something to your body. You need to adjust your body in some way in order to make your body conform to your mind. Your mind is who you truly are. I've seen it said many times to many people. You're a spirit embodied in a body. You're not a body with a mind, but you're a mind with a body. No, you're a body with a mind. You're a body that thinks. You are a body. And so that idea that somehow you as a self can be separated from your body, and that you as a self can be in conflict with your body, and you should prioritize your sense of self over your body. That's this elevation of this entity that isn't really an entity at all. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. There's some other interesting parts in this book, obviously, but I don't want this podcast to last forever. I would recommend picking it up if you're interested in pragmatism, and some of the more involved topics in that book will be explored in some future podcast episodes, because I'll be looking into the further writings of William James, and I'll begin to look at some of the books by John Dewey as well, and some others in the pragmatic tradition. So bit by bit, we're going to be diving deeper into pragmatism, and we'll begin to dive into structuralism as well, and see if we can put together a coherent, powerful philosophy that can be used to reinforce some of the notions of conservative America that don't necessarily rely on biblical teachings as many as many of the conservative ideas currently do. I think it's important that we develop secular conservative philosophical foundations, and pragmatism is incredibly important to that project. So with that said, I guess I'll wrap it up, and I will talk to you again next time. Bye.